Welcome to Professor Russell Esposito's channel on information security. This video is just one of many video modules that are part of Professor Esposito's course on the subject. Video modules for his entire information security course are located on this channel. So remember to hit the like button as well as subscribe if you enjoy the video. Thank you for watching.
Wireless security. So in this presentation, before we get into all of the wireless details listed on the screen, I have one slide that illustrates identical acronyms that mean different things. So I thought putting them on one slide might help students keep these acronyms straight, the different meanings, unfortunately, with the same identical acronyms. And we'll look at wireless protocols, the application wireless protocol stack, threats, vulnerabilities, different controls, ways to mitigate wireless threats, and MDMs, mobile device management, mobile device managers or mobile device management, the vendors that provide software on phones to improve mobile device security. So this is the slide that has these unfortunate acronyms that are the same but mean different things. So the first thing you'll see is WAP, W-A-P. This could be referring to the wireless protocol suite, so it's Wi-Fi software. But again, you have to read it in the context to understand if they're talking about this wireless protocol suite or WAP, wireless access point, the little Wi-Fi devices that you see in ceilings, sometimes with little lights and maybe an antenna or two, perhaps sometimes sticking out on older ones. So WAP could mean either of these things. And then there's the term MAC. We talked about the MAC, media address control address, MAC addresses, in an earlier presentation. And just to remind everyone, every device, every phone, every computer, every router, switch, all have a hard-coded MAC address that comes from the manufacturer. It's unchangeable. It's sort of like a social security number for the device. So there's a MAC addresses, right? There's also, when we talked about access controls in the earlier presentation, we talked about role-based access control and discretionary-based access control and mandatory access control, MAC. Again, this is the kind of access control where IT would define the security rules. So for example, the complexity of a password. It has to be alpha and a numeric character, a lowercase, an uppercase, special character. When passwords expire, these are mandatory access control features. They're not discretionary. They're not based on anyone's role. They're across the board universal, and they're also called MAC. And the last one is message authentication code, MAC, sometimes called HMAC. And this is a hashing technique on a data packet to ensure data integrity during transmission. So if you recall, we'll actually cover more of this when we go into the cryptology module, but essentially there's a hash that can happen, that occurs, certain protocols like HMAC, creates a hash total, sort of like a receipt, when you go grocery shopping, and a total, sort of a total of all the data in that data packet that gets summarized and hashed. And then when it gets received on the other end, after it's forwarded through a network or the internet, it gets recalculated, and the receipt needs to match the original receipt to ensure that the data hasn't changed or was somehow corrupted during the transmission. We'll go into this encryption and cryptology and different kinds of ways to encrypt data, including these hashes, in a later chapter. I think it's the next chapter. So let's talk about high-level encryption protocols. Now, of course, wireless is somewhat more susceptible by its very nature to interference or hacking because it's wireless. The hacker or the bad actor just needs to be in proximity to reach the Wi-Fi signal and try to sniff it or interfere with it or collect that information with a sniffer or a packet detector of some sort. So there are a few different, you may have seen these when you set up a Wi-Fi in your home. WPA is a protocol that's obsolete. It's no longer used. WEP, also in the first bullet here towards the end of the sentence, it's no longer used. So now the standards are WPA in red, you'll notice, and WPA Enterprise. These use much stronger encryption. You don't need to know exactly the details of the slide. Just know that WPA and WPA2 and WPA Enterprise are what's recommended now, because they use stronger encryption if you look at this paragraph here. But I'm not expecting people to know the details of what's behind these, like CCNP, AES, and TKIP. You may run across these terms, so you may remember that they're part of this, but it's not something that I expect people to know for an exam. But I just want to have this other information in the slide deck. In the previous slide, we talked about wireless encryption protocols. Now let's take a look at authentication protocols. So we had talked about how in an earlier network fundamentals module, we talked about 802.11 being the wireless protocol. Well, there's a more secure one that requires authentication, and that's 802.1x. So 802.1x can be used on a wired Ethernet network, but it's almost always used in a wireless network. And it requires that the WAP devices are connected to the back of a specific port, that the specific port on the back of a router or switch is the only one that can be used. So an unauthorized access, someone trying to plug in, their own WAP device, a hacker can't go into a wiring closet and plug in their own WAP device, because they won't know what port to use, physical port, to plug the wire for their wireless access point. So that's added authentication and security by being port based. And there'll be a server, an authentication server, where ID and password has to match to access that machine, and that's sometimes called a radius server. The second two paragraphs work with 802.1x, and these are also authentication protocols, but they require certificates. We'll learn more about security certificates in the cryptology chapter that's coming up, but essentially the certificate sort of certifies that the users are who they are, and that the security keys are authentic. And we'll discuss that later on. There's certificates you can create on your own internally, and there are certificates you can get from a third party that add additional validation of who's connecting to what, and where they are, and what URL they're connected to. So this is, but I don't expect you to know the details of EAP, TLS, and PEEP, but you should know what 802.1x is, that it requires port-based switch authentication. Okay, just want you to be aware, this WAP wireless protocol stack, we talked about the identical acronyms the first slide of this presentation. So here's the WAP wireless application protocol stack. To the right, you see the gray box. Might look a little similar to the OSI layer 7 stack we talked about earlier in the networking fundamentals chapter. But we'll just focus on this security layer, WTS. So it's like TLS, it's just WTLS for wireless, and it accommodates lower wireless bandwidth. That's essentially the difference. But it provides encryption, cryptology. It provides privacy, data integrity, authentication between devices in the wireless environment. All three, privacy, data encryption, data integrity, and authentication. Those three fundamentals. And it's similar to layer 4 in the OSI table, but instead of being, TLS security, it's WTLS. That's really the main difference. Okay, we went through some basics of wireless technology. Let's look at some of the threats. So this one screen, I think, does a pretty good job of explaining the different techniques that are used to hack a wireless network. So the first is a rogue access point. And this is a WAP, a wireless access point, that's not authorized. But it's typically done by a department that's not an IT department. There's another department in a company. Some of these companies can be very large with different divisions. They may not always go through IT. They could potentially be a little bit of a renegade or a maverick. It does happen. And someone might add their own rogue access point because IT is not that centralized, or it doesn't have tight control, or whatever the reasons are. They're not really trying to damage anything or steal information. They just want to put their own access point in to improve access connectivity, or maybe, add Wi-Fi to a conference room or to some dead spot on the floor. But IT doesn't know about it. It's really not a good practice, and it's considered a rogue access point because IT doesn't even know it exists. And then there's an evil twin, which is also a wireless access point, but this is done by a hacker who is trying to be an imposter, trying to mimic what a real WAP looks like, a wireless access point. And now they're not trying to sort of improve access for work. They want to direct traffic from this evil twin WAP, wireless access point, to their own network to steal data. So that's a bit different, right? The purpose is different. Essentially, it's kind of the same physical device as a rogue, but the evil twin is there functionally doing something different, very, very different, right? And then, of course, there's interference. It could be intentional. It could be unintentional, radio wave interference. There's lots of electronic magnetic frequency interference in the air that's, can be problematic. And places that have a lot of technology, like hospitals, sometimes have problems with Wi-Fi connectivity because of all of the EMF that's around in the environment. So that's generally more of an issue as opposed to an intentional block, but it can be a hacker who's trying to create a problem for a business. And then there's bluejacking, and this is unsolicited spam messages. Think of it that way, bluejacking. So again, they're sending message to your phone, and it's something you may not want, but they're not really damaging anything necessarily. And then there's blue snarfing, sometimes called blue bugging, and this is theft of your phone, and in some cases, taking control of your phone. So again, that's a little bit more dangerous than just bluejacking, where they're just trying to send you an unsolicited message for sales, some sort of commercial interest where they're trying to drive interest for that product. War driving is when someone drives around and they have a laptop with, usually something like Wireshark, and we're going to look at Wireshark later in the semester. It's software on a laptop, and they're looking and searching for wireless networks so they can identify weak encryption or no security at all, and they're going around trying to identify these. In the old days, there was war chalking, where they would have certain symbols. You can still find these symbols on the internet if you do a search, where they would chalk a building or chalk a sidewalk so other hackers would know that this is weak encryption, weak security, or no security. But that's sort of obsolete. Now there's this wiggle.net, which we talked about earlier in the semester, that website where you can do your war driving and then report your information to wiggle.net for all to see. So war chalking itself has become obsolete and really replaced by something a little more sophisticated, like wiggle.net. Then there was also initialization vectors, IV attacks, and they're also obsolete unless you're using older WEP security. And you can always remember WEP being a poor protocol for security, because you'll weep if you use WEP, right? Just put two E's in there, WEEP, and you'll remember that that's not a protocol you'll ever want to use. And then there's packet sniffing, right? Analyzing data packets. They may be stealing passwords or other data. And again, to the right here, I put a note. Wireshark is a common free sniffer. You can download Wireshark to your own laptop or your own device and sniff your own network and look at all the traffic in the network in your home, whether you have PCs or phones or cameras or Wi-Fi thermostats. You'll pick all that traffic up. But if you do download Wireshark, I would not recommend you take it to Starbucks or a bank or a hotel and try to sniff their network, which you'll be able to, but it's illegal. So you should only be sniffing with Wireshark or any other kind of Ethernet packet sniffing device on your own network, or if you have permission from someone to look at their network. So this one slide really summarizes the variety of wireless attacks that are the most common. Okay, so we've got a couple of slides now on wireless security controls. So in addition to what we learned about earlier in this class, physical, logical, network security, there are specific things for Wi-Fi technology that should be looked at to prevent hacking. So change the default SSID, the network identifier. If it's a simple name, you make it something more complex. Or if it's something that doesn't identify anything about you or your network. So change the default SSID. You could also prevent that from being broadcasted. That's the second bullet here. Do not broadcast the network SSID. So if you block the SSID from the network identifier, then when a guest visits your home, they will not see your network. You will have to tell them the network ID. They would have to key that into their phone or their laptop, and then of course they need a password as well. So that's another thing you can do to sort of keep bad actors away from your Wi-Fi. Change the default router password. Again, make it sufficiently complex, make it unique, and you can, particularly if it came with a, welcome one password or admin, which is or a word that's just too simple. Change default broadcast channel. You could make it so that if someone knows you're using a particular brand of router, of wireless router, they'll know that you can't. They won't know the channel that you're broadcasting on. Disable remote administration whenever possible. If you don't need it, disable it. Again, that's the rule we generally have. If you don't need a function, a service, a port, disable it. And then the two of the things that's in the middle of this slide deal with the antenna itself. So the antenna, the power can be adjusted in terms of how far you want to broadcast. So you might not want the antenna's power set so high that it broadcasts beyond the physical reach of your needs. And the other thing is there are two different kinds of antennas. There's omnidirectional. There's omnidirectional that broadcasts in every direction, which is pretty much the most common Wi-Fi antenna. And there are directional antennas. So for businesses, if they're trying to connect one subnetwork or a VLAN, virtual local area network, to another, and they know that they just need this connection, between these two devices, they can use a directional antenna. And sometimes these are on top of buildings, but so you have to take that into consideration when you're designing and architecting your Wi-Fi network. And then we talked about using WPA2 or WPA2 Enterprise with a radius server, some way to authenticate, to provide encryption, and also use 802.1x port security so that you limit any WAP from attaching to your network to a particular physical port on the back of your switch or your router. So these are the things. On this slide, we have one other slide we'll go to now to look at a few other technologies and techniques to help secure your wireless network. All right, some other things to do to secure your wireless network. Consider a VPN, right? If you're going through the internet, if you're going through some sort of network that you feel is not secure, create a VPN for your Wi-Fi. Consider a separate VLAN within your network to keep your Wi-Fi traffic somewhat isolated. You could even have a VLAN and have a firewall behind that to prevent additional, or a router with certain controls. But it's just having a separate VLAN isolates the traffic, right? You can employ MAC address filtering when it's feasible. And that means that you have to have the MAC address, the physical address of the phone, the laptop, the tablet, and you'll put a access control list, an ACL, into your router so that only those devices can access the Wi-Fi network. Now, if someone loses their phone or brings a different laptop or tablet, they won't be able to work because the MAC address is unknown to the ACL, the access control list, in the router. So that's why the wording here is when feasible. I have seen customers do that when they want really tight control, but the disadvantage is every new employee, you have to get the MAC address, you have to put it into the ACL list, the access control list. So it's more maintenance, right? But it's definitely tighter control. You can do something similar by assigning a static IP address to a device and do the same thing and lock down access to those specific IP addresses. In addition to that, penetration testing, every decent sized company is going to have an external partner or an external company try to penetrate their network, penetrate their Wi-Fi, penetrate their network, and whatever the vector is, whatever the attack approach is, to try to penetrate. And you pay, $25, $30, $40, $50,000 a year, but you need to include a Wi-Fi assessment as well. So penetration testing, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a later presentation, but the concept is to try to have an external professional, a pen tester or a penetration tester, get into your network and then help you identify your vulnerabilities and your weaknesses. And that pen test should include a Wi-Fi assessment as well. And then we're going to talk about mobile device management. There are vendors that are out there that provide some software for your mobile devices to help you give additional control. And we'll go through that in more detail in the next slide. So we talked about a number of technologies and techniques to protect wireless transmissions. Let's look at a specific situation where employers have employees that bring their own device to work, or BYOD, or YUOD, I like to call it, use your own device, because people are often working at home with their own devices. They're not bringing them anywhere. They're working from their homes. So how does a company handle the complexities and risks when you have a BYOD or UYOD situation? Well, the best way to manage it is with a mobile device management product. And at the top of this slide, you'll see there are a number of vendors who are, sort of lead the pack in MDM security software. So what does MDM security software do? Well, we're going to go through this slide, but I also have a number of short videos from various companies that explain and show graphically in their videos how this works. So essentially, an MDM product partitions the entire device, the very first bullet here, for corporate applications. So you have person's personal phone with their partition, and then another partition with corporate functions. And you can control the applications on that partition. So these MDM tools can add and remove various applications through the MDM software. So software obviously goes on the phone, the MDM agent goes on the phone, and then the company, usually IT, they'll log on to the mobile device management account and be able to control the remote devices, phones, tablets, laptops, etc., that are mobile. And third bullet here, you can manage how the device is accessed with a screen lock PIN number. You can force that policy, that electronic policy, onto the phone or a tablet. You can remotely wipe a phone if somebody's terminated or resigns and it doesn't really go through the proper outboarding. We're removing their corporate information from the phone. You can wipe the phone. You can just wipe the corporate part of the phone. You can wipe the phone after X number of failed attempts. So if you're assuming that there's a hacker trying to brute force their way in and trying a number of different passwords that they feel this person may be using, you can lock the phone that way. You can wipe the whole phone, brick it essentially. Sometimes it's called bricking the phone, just like a brick in a brick house. It becomes a brick, a useless lump essentially. The other thing you can do with these phones is do GPS tracking. Generally, this is done on corporate phones. It could be controversial even on corporate phones. More controversial if you do it on someone's personal phone. But this happens with contractors. I did a lot of work for a company that's a national anesthesia company that has about 3,000 anesthesiologists in a dozen states, and they contract with hospitals to provide anesthesiology services for neurology, for OB, for peds, general surgery, and they ensure that there is an anesthesiologist there for surgery all the time. ORs never has downtime because of not having the right anesthesiologist there. So these anesthesiologists, there are companies that provide ER doctors, radiologists as well, but they have a little software for their time, recording their time on the phone, and when they get within, say, 100 feet of the hospital's router, Wi-Fi, they can log on. They can't log on, while they're driving, 20 minutes away from the hospital. So that's the GPS fencing. So the application only allows them to record that time that they got to work. So contractors use this. They can only do that when they're within that fence, within that GPS fence. So it becomes a handy tool or sort of device or function with a time and attendance reporting system, sort of like a time clock, right, on the phone that allows them to log in or automatically log in with an acceptance push to say, yes, I'm at the hospital and I'm beginning my work, or I've left at this time. Home workers Sometimes people who, professionals or aides who go to people's homes can also use time and attendance systems with GPS tracking. Kind of interesting concept. Of course, the next bullet, maintain inventory. The MDMs usually help with this. They know all of the devices. The MDM software knows all the devices it's managing. So it could help with the inventory, who has the device, what's the operating system, what kind of device, is it Android, is it Apple? It can control device encryption. It can even push a locally created certificates, security certificates. We're going to talk more about certificates, a security certificate in the next cryptology chapter. But essentially, we'll go into a little more details later on, and this will make more sense to you. But you could actually create your own digital encryption keys to encrypt and decrypt, or you could get it from a third party, which a lot of large websites do. But for your MDM controlling devices, you don't have to buy these certificates. You could just create your own, either using a Windows server or something called OpenSSL, and create these certificates that generates the keys to decrypt. It does other things too. It generates keys to encrypt and decrypt information on the device. And when we say locally created, I mean the employer can do this themselves. You don't need to buy these keys or these certificates, from third parties. And we'll go through the meaning of these certificates in the next presentation, in the cryptology module. And then the last couple of bullets here, on-device antivirus. You could push and pull antivirus, update antivirus with your MDM software. In some situations where it's necessary to disable Bluetooth or a video camera, you can do that as well. So you can see there's quite a panoply of different things you can do with mobile device management. And of course, the very last sentence here, you need policies, you need to train employees, they need to understand when they're onboarded, meaning when they're hired, when they're offboarded, when they leave the company. You need to have an AUP, an acceptable use policy, how are these devices going to be used when you bring your own device to work, and who owns the data. Sometimes that's an issue, particularly with vendors. Sometimes it needs to be clarified. So these are all the things that at a high level an MDM device can do. And in the next slide, you'll see a list of quick videos from some of these vendors that I think will help fill in the gaps and make it crystal clear how these devices work. Not in specific, not high detail, but make sure you have a good understanding of what these devices, what these software devices are all about. So these short videos, the first one here is about protocol 802.1x, which is that wireless protocol that adds additional security by designating a particular port in the back of a router by which a WAP, a wireless access point, connects to the network. So that's one video, but the remaining videos here really illustrate how the MDM works. I think you'll find it interesting. The TikTok one, I guess it's the third item down here, mobile line and TikTok. That's kind of an interesting video as well that really shows the details of how these MDM products work pretty well. So I hope you enjoyed the videos and I hope you enjoyed the chapter.